Hello and welcome to new Caro-Kann tutorial. Today I will explain the main line in depth. So this is the position where we start with the classical variation. It happens after either knight d2 or c3, because we take on e4 anyway. Now classical approach is bishop f5, other moves like knight d7 or f6 are different variations. Now this knight can move in three directions, or it can be defended by f3 or bishop d3, but that is weak. Let's just quickly see what happens after knight c5. Well, we can challenge this knight in many ways, such as e5, e6, b6, or even knight d7. After f5, white of course doesn't take, because then queen takes queen and white can't castle anymore. But this move allows knight takes b7, so we have to continue with queen b6, and after knight c5, we can regain the pawn with bishop takes c5. Even though we have this pawn structure, similar to some lines of the Italian game, we are more developed as black, which makes this position perfectly equal. I would actually rather play black here, because as they say, development is key. Knight f6 is also possible here, and after knight takes b7, queen b6, and then e5 will challenge the knight anyway. However, these are very rare lines, so I won't be telling you too much about them. Anyway, it may lead to positions with a lot of development for black, and the position is equal or even better for black, even though it sacrificed a pawn. After knight c5, you can also answer with knight d7. And after knight takes b7, queen b6 and knight takes knight on c5, and then we regain a pawn, similar to the e5 or e6 lines. The last move I will show you after this rare knight c5 is b6, which immediately challenges the knight to retreat to b3. And after e6, we have a weak c6 pawn, but actually now we can just normally develop. So after bishop f5, challenging the knight if the bishop d3, we can just take the pawn and we are quite equal. And in this position, if knight retreats to c3, we just need to develop normally and we have already equalized. But the main move here, and what I think you will get in 10 out of 10 games after bishop f5, is knight g3, which attacks our bishop. If we retreat to e6, the position becomes much better for white, and we will have problems with developing our dark squared bishop, but the position is actually playable, so if you want to confuse your opponent, check this line out with the engine, and don't care much about the evaluation which shows that white is a pawn up. Most players don't know this line, because of all the problems I was talking about earlier, but the game might still lead to interesting positions. Anyway, the main and the best move is bishop g6. Now white has quite a few options of how to continue the game. Let's first look at h4. Well, h4 is actually challenging our bishop again. We have to play either e5 or e6, otherwise our bishop might get trapped. If we play e5, g5 square will be always free for white's knight, but engines say the position is equal, and if you manage to castle queenside, it can all lead to interesting positions. The main way to answer h4 is to play h6. After knight f3, we have to prevent the knight from coming to e5, so the only move here is knight d7. Now there are two ways white can continue, but it transposes to similar positions. It just depends on if white wants to put the pawn on h5 or not, but bishop d3 will follow anyway. So let's say after h5, bishop h7, bishop d3, now we have to exchange, so bishop takes and queen takes d3. Then e6 in order to develop a bishop. There are four possible continuations, but let's first just look at bishop f4. The game continues with queen a5 check, bishop d2, bishop b4, c3, and then bishop to e7. At d6 it may get kicked to e7 anyway, so bishop e7, c4, and queen c7. Now for white, castling kingside is inadvisable as h5 pawn will be very weak. White can go for d5, and that leads to some very interesting positions, but I think black stands a bit better after all. Main move is castling queenside and knight f6. White may continue with knight e4 or rook e1, and white needs to launch the attack on kingside. Anyway, king b1 and castles is a safe move, before both players launch the attack. Now rook h to e1 takes the space of an open file, and black responds with f5. White continues with knight e4, and we can either place our bishop on b4 or exchange the knight. After knight takes e4, Queen takes e4 and knight f6, queen retreats to e2, and we continue with bishop b4. White can now place its knight on a beautiful e5 square, and later start pushing g and f pawns. We have come to more than 20th move, and as even though this is a main line, you will rarely see it so deep, because it might earlier transpose or something else, so let's stop here. Instead of h5, a direct bishop d3 might approach. We shall of course exchange it, and then we will transpose to a position similar to what we have seen earlier, but with pawn on h4 instead of h5, which actually lets the knight to enter that square. We can castle queenside here, and the pawn on g7 can't really be taken, because after knight f6, the white's knight would have no escape squares. But let's go all the way back to this h4 move. Instead of it, the white can also play knight d2 or knight h3, which often indirectly attacks our bishop. I will cover this in another video, or we will go in depth for a whole so-called floor variation. But white here can also play knight f3, bishop c4, bishop f4, or pawn c4. Let's begin with knight f3. This move actually attacks two squares, or it can threat hand to take our bishop. The only move is knight d7, and it covers the weak e5 square. After knight h4, we are fine with trading our bishop, as we will recapture with the h-pawn. So we continue with e6. Knight takes and h-pawn takes. And now this position is totally equal, and there is probably 8 possible moves, so I will stop here. However, after knight f3, knight d7, h4 is also possible, which transposes to the long lines we were looking at earlier. After bishop f4, e5 square is weak again, but we have to develop, and on any knight f3 move, we play knight d7, and on any capture of our light-squared bishop, we recapture with the h-pawn. Bishop c4 only threat hands our f6 pawn, but after e6 and some kind of normal Caro-Kann development we will be fine. If c4, we might even reroute our knight to c7 or something, and after knight s6, c5 really shouldn't be played, since we can then access the b4 square. So the only move after knight s6 might be a3. There might be some interesting lines, but this is a very rare position, so if all you want, check it with an engine. I hope you learned something new, and that you enjoyed the video. Goodbye.